I had a good Saturday lined up, a quiet weekend to decompress. Then the doorbell rang, interrupting what was meant to be the first real, peaceful day in weeks. I didn't expect a package, especially not one addressed to my wife. But there it was, a plain brown box with no markings other than our names. Curiosity got the best of me, and I cracked it open, not knowing I was about to stare down the truth. Inside, in the center of the box, lay a heap of ash, scattered with fragments of lace and a note. I didn't get it at first. The color, the texture, even the lingering smell. My brain didn't connect it until I picked up the note beside the ashes and read it. It said, in a neat, deliberate hand, "You gave her away, so here's what's left." Those ashes. They were the remnants of my wife's wedding dress. My mind reeled, desperate for an explanation that wasn't what it appeared to be. But no matter how I turned it around, it all came back to one thing. She was with someone else. Suddenly, I couldn't stand still. I grabbed my keys and left the house, racing through every memory and sign I'd ignored. For too long, I'd brushed off her unexplained absences, her new late nights. I'd told myself I was just paranoid. But here it was in black and white, as tangible as the ashes in that box. I sped through town, my grip tight on the steering wheel, replaying everything I'd ignored. All those little clues I'd told myself were nothing. Her late work dinners, the way she'd started putting extra care into her appearance, even when we weren't going out, and how she'd become so protective of her phone, always keeping it face down or within arm's reach. My thoughts turned to who could have sent that box. Someone close, that much was clear. They knew our address, her dress, and the significance of those ashes. Whoever did this wanted me to feel the depth of the betrayal. Finally, I parked a few blocks away from the house. I needed to catch her off guard. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my mind was spinning. What would I even say? What did I want from her? A confession, the truth? As much as I wanted answers, I dreaded what they might be. I approached the house quietly, careful not to make any noise. Her car was in the driveway, but there was another car parked just down the block. A black sedan. I'd never seen it before. I made my way around the side of the house, looking for a way in that would let me observe before she even knew I was there. I peeked through a window and saw her in the living room, talking on her phone, pacing back and forth. Her expression was tense, eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but I didn't have to. The way she looked, the nervous energy in her movements, it was like she was expecting something. Suddenly, she ended the call and tossed her phone onto the couch, rubbing her temples as though trying to process something. I slipped through the back door quietly, heart pounding. I stepped into the living room and she froze the moment she saw me. For a second, she looked like she was seeing a ghost. What, what are you doing here?" she stammered, her eyes flicking toward the front door. "I think the real question is what you have been doing," I replied, holding up the note from the box. Her face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a word, I heard footsteps on the front porch. The front door creaked open and a man stepped in. Tall, confident, like he owned the place. He looked from her to me, his face turning from surprise to something almost like smug recognition. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. I stood there, staring at this stranger, trying to keep my composure as anger bubbled just beneath the surface. He didn't flinch. Instead, he closed the door behind him as if he belonged here, as if he was comfortable in my home. My wife's face twisted into something between fear and shame, her eyes darting between us, searching for words that wouldn't come. I took a step closer to him, sizing him up. He was taller than me by a couple of inches, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that radiated arrogance. That smug smirk told me everything I needed to know. He didn't just know about our life, he'd been part of it. "So," I said, barely recognizing my own voice, "you're the one she's been sneaking around with." He tilted his head, that infuriating smirk never leaving his face. "Guess the cat's out of the bag, huh?" he said, crossing his arms. There was no remorse in his tone, no hint of apology, as if this confrontation was just another game to him. "You think this is a joke?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Sneaking around with another man's wife, then sending me a box of ashes? You did that, didn't you?" He shrugged as if it was nothing. "Well, Let's just say I wanted to make sure you knew what she was worth to you. Figured it was about time you caught up. I lunged before I knew what I was doing, shoving him hard against the wall. Who the hell do you think you are? I spat, my fists clenched tight, knuckles white with the rage pulsing through me. He didn't fight back, but he didn't back down either. Instead, he straightened his shirt with a casual, unaffected air. I'm the one who gave her what you couldn't, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. She didn't tell you? It's been going on for months. Behind me, my wife let out a small, broken gasp, and I turned, catching her eyes. Is it true? I asked, my voice a mix of accusation and disbelief. I wanted her to deny it, to say this was some twisted misunderstanding. But she just stood there, looking at me like a deer caught in headlights. I didn't mean for it to happen this way, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But he just, oh, spare me, I cut her off, the betrayal twisting deeper into my gut with every word. You couldn't just talk to me? You had to sneak around behind my back? My voice grew louder, the emotions I'd been holding in for so long boiling over. I was putting everything I had into us, trying to make it work. And you were just off with him? She opened her mouth to reply, but he stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was a possessive gesture, one that made my blood boil. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to her, he said, she wouldn't have come to me. Without thinking, I shoved him again, harder this time. His back hit the wall, and I could see a flash of anger in his eyes now, his smirk finally slipping. That's enough, he warned, raising his voice. You want to get physical? Fine, but don't say I didn't give you a chance to back down. Back down, I laughed bitterly, squaring up to him. You come into my house, sleep with my wife, send me this sick little gift, and you think I'm going to back down? He raised his hands mockingly, but his expression turned dark. Look, I'll do you a favor and walk out of here. But understand this, I'm not done seeing her, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. I felt every nerve in my body snap as I swung. The impact of my fist colliding with his face reverberated through my arm, but I didn't care. He staggered back, wiping blood from his split lip, his smirk long gone now. He lunged forward, his fists coming up, and before I knew it, we were grappling, trading punches and shoves, the anger driving each hit harder than the last. In the chaos, I saw my wife's face, horrified, screaming at us to stop. But I couldn't. The betrayal, the humiliation, the rage, I couldn't let it go. He threw a punch, catching me in the jaw, and I stumbled back, tasting blood, but the pain only fueled me more. I pushed forward again, landing another blow that sent him reeling. Suddenly, my wife threw herself between us, her hands pressing against my chest, forcing me back. Stop it! Both of you, just stop! She screamed, her voice breaking. I froze, breath ragged, fists still clenched, staring at her. You did this, I said, my voice choked with betrayal. You brought this into our home. She covered her face with her hands, breaking down. And in that moment, he seized the opportunity to slip past us, heading for the door. He paused, glancing back with one last look of contempt. See you around, he muttered, then turned and disappeared. I watched him go, feeling the weight of it all crashing down on me. I looked back at my wife, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed, her face hidden. I wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, but all I felt was emptiness. She stood there, shoulders trembling, her face hidden in her hands. I waited, hoping she'd find some words, an apology, anything. But the silence stretched on, broken only by her muffled sobs. I wanted to feel sympathy, to comfort her. But after what I'd just witnessed, there was nothing left but a hollow ache. You're not going to say anything? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. But it cut through the room like a knife. She took a shaky breath, finally looking up. Her face was a mess of smeared mascara and guilt. And for a brief moment, I saw the woman I'd married, the one I'd built a life with, who I'd thought would always stand by me. But she was a stranger now, standing in the wreckage of our life together. I didn't plan for it to go this far, she began, her voice wavering. It just happened. Just happened? I repeated, feeling a fresh surge of anger. Months of sneaking around and that's all you've got? It just happened? What about us? You didn't think I deserved the truth? She flinched at my words, but shook her head, struggling to find an answer. I didn't want to hurt you, okay? I thought I could end it before you found out, but I don't know. Things just got out of control. The words hit me like a slap. Out of control, I echoed, nodding slowly. But you kept going, right in front of me, lying every time you came home late. Every time you looked me in the eye and told me everything was fine, I trusted you. Tears streamed down her face now, but I didn't feel anything. She reached out as if to touch my arm, to bring me close, but I stepped back, shaking my head. Don't, just don't. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue, to fight for something. But then her shoulders slumped, and she sank down onto the couch, burying her face in her hands again. I messed up, okay? She said, her voice muffled. I thought I was unhappy, that he was giving me something you couldn't, and I don't know. I made a mistake. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. Unforgivable? I shot back, my voice rising. It was never just one mistake, was it? It was every lie you told me, every time you chose him over us. How many nights did you spend with him? How many times did you look at me and think you'd rather be with him? She shook her head, looking defeated. I don't know, I lost myself, okay? I didn't know who I was anymore. So, you thought destroying everything we built would help you find yourself? I asked bitterly, the words twisting in my throat. Did it? Did breaking every promise we made get you where you wanted to be? Her lip trembled, and for a second, I thought she might lash out, argue, try to justify it all. But she just sat there, her face a mask of regret and shame. No, she whispered. No, it didn't. I could feel my resolve cracking, the anger and heartbreak settling into something darker, something that made me question everything I'd believed about her, about us. I sat down in the armchair across from her, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. What was the plan? I asked, my voice low and cold. Were you going to keep lying forever? Just string me along until he got tired of you too? She looked down, not meeting my eyes. I don't know. I kept telling myself I'd end it, that I'd come back to you, but he kept pulling me back. Or maybe, I said bitterly, you just wanted to keep both of us. Have your safety net at home while you chase some fantasy on the side. She didn't deny it, and that silence felt like another punch to the gut. I stood up, suddenly feeling claustrophobic, like I couldn't breathe with her in the same room. I need some air, I muttered, heading for the door. I was halfway out when I stopped, turning back to face her. This marriage, I thought it meant something. I thought we meant something. She didn't respond, just sat there, shoulders slumped, the weight of her choices finally settling over her. And as I looked at her one last time, I realized that the woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd built my life with, was gone. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap, clearing my head. I didn't know what I'd do next, where I'd go from here. But one thing was certain. I couldn't go back to the life we had. Because whatever we'd had, it was gone, reduced to ashes, just like her dress. The weight of that realization settled over me as I walked away from the house, away from her, knowing that I was leaving behind not just her, but everything I thought we'd shared. I walked down the street, the cold biting through my jacket, but I didn't feel it. The numbness went deeper than anything the air could touch. Every step I took felt surreal, like I was drifting away from my own life. For years, my world had been built around her. I'd made every choice, every sacrifice with her in mind. Now, all of that was meaningless. It felt like I was leaving behind the man I thought I was, the husband, the provider, the partner, and walking into an unknown void. I didn't know who I was without her, and that terrified me almost as much as the betrayal itself. I found myself at the small park near our house. I sat down on one of the benches, burying my face in my hands. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, the reality sank in. She had betrayed me, intentionally, repeatedly, and without any regard for what it would do to me, and I had been too blind to see it coming. All the memories, the love we'd shared, felt tainted now. Every kiss, every laugh, every quiet night on the couch, it all seemed like a lie. I'd trusted her so completely that I'd ignored every warning sign. Now I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I'd been a fool all along. As I sat there, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting it to be her, another plea for forgiveness, some desperate attempt to explain herself. But it wasn't. It was a text from my best friend, Derek. He'd known something was off for weeks, but I'd always brushed him off, convinced that I was overthinking things. Derek, hey man, just checking in. You doing all right? I stared at the screen, the simple question cutting through me like a knife. For years, I'd been the one people came to when they needed help or advice, but now I was the one who didn't know how to go on. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I texted him back. Me, can you meet me at the park? Not 5 minutes later, Derek showed up, his face full of worry. He sat down beside me, saying nothing, just waiting. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, I forced myself to speak. She's been cheating, I said, my voice barely a whisper. For months, maybe longer. I don't know. Derek's face fell and he put a hand on my shoulder, his grip solid and grounding. Man, I'm so sorry. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I don't know who I am without her, I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I built everything around her. I thought we were forever. You're still you, he said quietly. She doesn't get to take that from you, and she doesn't get to define your life either. You're better than what she's done. I shook my head, feeling the familiar sting of tears I was too tired to fight. I don't know how to start over, Derek. I don't even know where to begin. He didn't try to sugarcoat it. It's going to be hard, but you have to take it one day at a time. Right now, just focus on getting through this moment. Tomorrow we'll figure out what's next. Hearing him say we made something inside me shift. I wasn't alone, not completely. I had people who cared, people who would stand by me even when everything else felt like it was crumbling. After a while, Derek got up, clapping me on the shoulder. Come on, let's get you out of the cold and back to my place. You can crash there as long as you need to. No strings, no questions. I looked at him, grateful for the lifeline he was offering. I'd lost my home, my marriage, my future, but I hadn't lost everything. I still had friends, people who would help me rebuild, piece by painful piece. As we walked toward his car, I took one last look back toward the house I'd once called home. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that I couldn't go back to the life I'd left behind. That chapter was closed, burned to ashes like her dress. Now, it was time to face whatever lay ahead, one step at a time. In that moment, I decided I'd let myself mourn what was lost. But someday, somehow, I'd find a way to start again. Because I had to. A few days passed. I stayed at Derek's place, trying to get a grip on the chaos that had swallowed my life whole. But nothing felt right. My mind kept going back to that smug look on the guy's face as he stood in my home, taunting me, acting like he owned the place, like he owned her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him there, felt the ache in my jaw where he'd hit me. I tried to push it down, tell myself it didn't matter. But it was like a fire burning at the back of my mind. One night, Derek walked into the living room where I was staring blankly at the TV and tossed me a set of keys. Come on, he said, an edge in his voice I hadn't heard before. Get up. We're going for a drive. We got into his truck and he didn't say where we were going. I didn't ask. I was glad for the distraction, something to do, other than sit around letting the anger eat away at me. After a while, he parked near an upscale part of town by a row of luxury condos overlooking the lake. This is his place, Derek said, his voice low. I asked around, figured out where he lives. The words hung in the air between us. I looked at him, surprised, and he shrugged, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Figured you'd want to know, he said simply. Every rational part of me screamed to just let it go, to walk away. But as I stared at the sleek modern building, the anger I'd been trying to suppress flared up. That guy had walked into my life, destroyed my marriage, laughed in my face, and then walked away without a second thought, and I'd let him. Every hit, every insult, every mocking smile replayed in my mind like a reel, driving my anger higher until it was all I could feel. Come on, I muttered, slamming the car door and walking toward the building. We found his unit on the second floor. I could feel my heart pounding, adrenaline rushing through me as I raised my hand and banged hard on the door. For a moment, I wasn't sure he was even there. But then, I heard footsteps approaching, and the door opened to reveal the man himself, standing there in his expensive clothes, a look of pure annoyance crossing his face when he saw me. "You've got some nerve showing up here," he said, a smirk already creeping onto his face. I didn't say a word, just took one step forward, and before he could react, I swung, my fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling back into his condo. He barely managed to catch himself against the wall, but I didn't give him a chance to recover. The anger I'd been holding back for days came pouring out as I hit him again, each punch fueled by every betrayal, every lie, every ounce of humiliation he'd put me through. "Who the hell do you think you are?" I shouted, grabbing him by his shirt and shoving him backward. He crashed into a glass coffee table, sending shards flying as he scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his lip. "Oh, you want to fight?" he sneered, coming at me with a wild swing. I dodged, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back, forcing him down onto the floor. "You don't get to just walk away," I growled. "You ruined my life. You think you're just going to go on with yours like nothing happened?" He struggled, but I held firm, pressing him harder into the floor. "Listen, man," he spat, his voice strained. "You were just a backup plan for her. Face it, you never really meant anything." Something inside me snapped. I pulled him up and shoved him into the wall, slamming him hard enough that he gasped. "Shut up. You don't know anything about us," I said, my voice tight with rage. "Oh, I know enough," he sneered, blood trickling from his nose. "She'd complain about you constantly, how boring you were, how she wanted someone with, let's just say, more fire." He grinned, defiant, even as I held him in place. "I'm that someone." For a second, I saw red. I tightened my grip, lifting him slightly off his feet, my fist cocked back to hit him again. But then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Derek, his face calm, his voice low and steady. "He's not worth it, man," Derek said. "Not another second of your time. Let him go." I hesitated, the adrenaline still surging, my anger screaming for release. But Derek's words cut through the haze. Taking a deep breath, I let go of the guy, stepping back, my hands shaking. The guy stumbled, catching himself against the wall, and he shot me a look full of fury and resentment. "You're pathetic," he spat, wiping the blood from his mouth. "No wonder she left." I clenched my fists, ready to go at him again, but Derek stepped in, blocking my path. "Come on," he said, his voice firm. "We're done here." I took one last look at the man who had torn my life apart, a man who thought he was untouchable. For a moment, I wanted nothing more than to see him broken. But then, as I looked around at his expensive condo, the fancy things that filled it, I realized something. He had nothing. For all his smugness, all his arrogance, he was hollow, and he always would be. Without another word, I turned and walked out, Derek beside me. The drive back was quiet. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, my knuckles sore and bruised, my mind buzzing with everything I'd just done. Derek kept glancing over at me, like he was waiting for me to say something, to react, but I had nothing left. The anger, the adrenaline, it was all spent, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. When we finally pulled up to his place, Derek cut the engine and turned to face me. "Feel better?" he asked, his voice soft but serious. I let out a slow breath, still staring out at the quiet street. "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel some kind of, I don't know, closure, I guess. Like it would help me move on, but all I feel is empty." Derek nodded as if he understood. "It's not going to disappear overnight, man. What you're feeling, it's normal. You lost everything. It's going to take time to rebuild." We went inside, and as I washed my hands in the bathroom, I looked up at my reflection. I didn't recognize the man staring back. He looked older, worn down, as if he'd aged years in a matter of days. There were bags under my eyes, and my expression was one of someone who had seen too much, felt too much. The silence of the house settled around me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the weight of it all. I sank down onto the edge of the bed Derek had set up for me, my head in my hands, and the tears finally came. I wasn't angry anymore. I was grieving. Grieving for the life I'd lost, for the trust I'd given so freely, for the love I'd thought was real. Derek knocked softly on the doorframe, leaning in. "Hey, I know you probably just want to be alone right now, but I thought you should know. She's been calling." My heart clenched at that. Part of me wanted to ignore her calls forever, to erase her from my life and never look back. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the good times, the promises we'd made, needed answers. I nodded. Thanks, Derek. I'll call her when I'm ready. He gave me a supportive nod and left, closing the door softly behind him. I sat there for what felt like hours, wrestling with myself, trying to decide whether I could even bear to hear her voice. But finally, I picked up my phone, took a deep breath, and dialed her number. She answered on the first ring, her voice shaky and full of desperation. Hello, is this... Please, just let me explain. I didn't say anything at first, just let her voice wash over me, a mixture of memories and regret. Finally, I found the strength to speak. You owe me the truth, I said, my voice steady but cold. No more excuses, no more lies. Just tell me, why? She took a shaky breath. I don't know how it happened. It started as a distraction, I guess. I felt lost, empty, like something was missing, and he made me feel, alive. I closed my eyes, feeling the sting of her words. And I didn't? All those years we spent together, the life we built, that wasn't enough? No, she whispered, her voice breaking. It was, but I lost myself. I thought maybe he could fill that hole, but I was wrong. I see that now. I was wrong about everything. Her confession didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. If anything, it hurt more, hearing her acknowledge how little I'd meant in the face of her own selfish needs. You didn't just hurt me, I said quietly. You destroyed us. I know, she replied, and I could hear the tears in her voice. I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. If I could go back, I would, but I can't. I sighed, feeling a strange, bittersweet acceptance settling over me. I'd come looking for closure, for answers, but there was no answer that could undo what had been done. No words would make it right. You've made your choices, I said finally, and now I have to make mine. There was a long silence on the other end, and then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I understand. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I am. With that, I hung up, the finality of it hitting me like a blow. The line went dead, and I sat there, phone in hand, feeling the weight of it all. The chapter was closed. There was no going back. I put the phone down and lay back, staring up at the ceiling. In the quiet, I felt a strange, tentative sense of peace. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a glimmer of something new, something beyond the pain. And as I lay there, I realized that this was just the beginning. The following days passed slowly. I stayed with Derek, splitting my time between long walks through the neighborhood and quiet nights on his couch. Each day felt a little less heavy, the weight of anger and grief easing bit by bit. But the emptiness was still there, this hollow space left by everything I'd lost. Derek tried to get me out more to distract me, and eventually, I agreed to go out for a drink. We ended up at a small bar just outside town, the kind of place where nobody knew you, where you could be anonymous for a while. I welcomed the break. We took a seat at the bar, and Derek ordered us a couple of beers. As we sat there, he kept the conversation light, asking about work, old friends, anything that wasn't about her or the mess my life had become. It was exactly what I needed. A few minutes of normalcy, something that felt like the world I used to know. But halfway through our drinks, I glanced up and froze. There, in the back corner of the bar, sitting at a table with a few other people, was the last person I expected to see. Him. The guy who had destroyed my marriage, sitting there laughing, relaxed, like nothing in the world was wrong. He had a beer in hand, surrounded by friends, smiling without a care. For a moment, the shock held me still. Then the anger rose, sharp and familiar. What is it? Derek asked, noticing my change in expression. I nodded toward the back. It's him, I said, keeping my voice low. The guy. He's here. Derek turned to look, and his jaw tightened. You want to go? He asked, ready to leave if that's what I needed. But something inside me refused to back down. Seeing him there, so carefree, laughing like he hadn't torn my life apart, was too much. He hadn't lost a thing, hadn't suffered a single consequence for what he'd done. And as I watched him, The need for some kind of resolution, some kind of justice, overwhelmed me. No, I said, feeling a steely resolve take hold. I'm not leaving. I got up and walked across the bar, ignoring Derek's quiet warning behind me. When I reached his table, he looked up, his smile fading as he recognized me. For a second, he looked uncomfortable, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair with that smug, familiar smirk. Well, look who it is, he said, his voice casual, like we were old friends. Didn't expect to see you here. I kept my gaze steady, refusing to be baited by his arrogance. I didn't come here to see you, I replied, keeping my voice low. But since you're here, I think you and I have a few things to settle. His friends shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other before mumbling excuses and slipping away, leaving just the two of us at the table. He looked around as if trying to decide whether to stand or make a run for it, but I blocked him in. What do you want? He asked, sounding annoyed. Didn't we settle this already? Settle? I repeated, feeling the bitterness rise. No, you got off easy. I'm the one left picking up the pieces of my life while you keep going like nothing happened. He rolled his eyes. Look, man, I get it. You're hurt, you're angry, but she made her choice. She came to me. If you can't deal with that, it's not my problem. I clenched my fists, every instinct screaming at me to hit him, to make him feel even a fraction of what I'd felt. But I forced myself to stay calm. You're right, I said, my voice steady. She made her choice, and so did you. But that doesn't mean you're innocent. You walked into my life, into my home, and destroyed everything I cared about. You've taken enough from me. He laughed, the sound dripping with disdain. You really think you're the first guy this has happened to? Grow up. Life's not fair. The words were like fuel on a fire. But instead of lashing out, I looked him straight in the eye and said, You're right. Life isn't fair. But people like you, it catches up to them eventually, he scoffed. You don't scare me. If you're here to throw a punch, just do it and get it over with. Otherwise, stop wasting my time. I could feel the tension crackling, the adrenaline ready to explode. But then, I remembered something Derek had told me. You're better than this. I unclenched my fists, letting out a slow breath. I didn't need to stoop to his level. Hurting him wouldn't fix anything. It would just give him one more reason to believe he was right. You're not worth it, I said finally, my voice calm but firm. You think you're invincible, that nothing will ever touch you. But you're wrong. Someday, you'll feel what I'm feeling now. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you will. And when that day comes, you'll realize how much you took from people who trusted you. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, or maybe doubt. I held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked away, my heart pounding. I left him there in that crowded bar, his smirk wiped clean off his face. Derek met me at the door, a look of relief mixed with surprise. You didn't... No, I said, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. He's not worth it. We walked out into the cool night air, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a strange sense of freedom. I'd faced him, faced my pain, and walked away, choosing not to let him define me. The power he'd held over me was gone, and with it, a weight I hadn't known I was carrying lifted. It was time to start over, to rebuild, to find a new path, one that didn't include him or the pain he'd caused, one where I could finally move forward, free. A week after that confrontation at the bar, I was settling into a quiet routine at Derek's place. Life was a little less chaotic, the emotions raw but finally manageable. I'd almost convinced myself that this chapter was closing, that I could move forward without any more drama or surprises. Then, one evening, just as Derek and I were about to head out for dinner, a loud knock echoed through his front door. I froze, an uneasy feeling gnawing at me. Derek exchanged a look with me before opening the door. It was her. She stood there looking disheveled and anxious, her eyes bloodshot like she hadn't slept in days. She glanced from Derek to me, clutching her purse like it was a lifeline. Please, can I talk to you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Derek looked to me, silently asking if he should send her away. Part of me wanted to tell her to leave, to end this right then and there. But I knew that whatever she'd come to say was something I needed to hear, if only to end this nightmare once and for all. All right, I said, stepping outside. Let's talk. Derek gave me a supportive nod and closed the door behind me, leaving us standing there on the porch, under the cold, stark light of the porch lamp. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, she stammered, her voice trembling with desperation. I know I've said it before, but I don't know how else to say it. I ruined everything, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But please, I need you to understand. I'm a mess without you. I looked at her, not a trace of the sympathy I might have felt once. You didn't come here to make things right, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. You came here because your life isn't working out the way you thought it would. You chose this. You made this bed, and now you're dealing with the fallout. She flinched, her eyes welling up, but I pushed forward. You think I'm going to swoop in and save you? After everything you put me through? I know. I know I don't deserve it, she whispered, her voice breaking. But I'm here because I can't let it end like this. I lost you and I lost myself in the process. I just want one chance to make it right, to be the person I was supposed to be. I felt my fists clench involuntarily. She was trying to pull me back in, to make me believe in some fantasy that she could fix what she had shattered. But I wasn't that man anymore. She had killed him. You say you want a chance to make it right, I said slowly, fighting to keep my voice steady. But you had every chance, every day for years, and you threw it away. Her face twisted with grief, and she took a step toward me, reaching out. Please, I'll do anything. I'll cut him out of my life. I'll prove it to you. Just give us one more chance. I stepped back, out of reach, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. Number. You didn't just betray me. You destroyed the life we built, and I'll never get that back. The tears spilled over, but I felt nothing. Not pity, not love, just a calm finality. This was the end, and we both knew it. Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded as if she finally understood. She wiped at her tears, took one last shuddering breath, then turned and walked down the steps without another word. I stood there, watching her disappear into the night, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't known I was still carrying. For the first time since this all began, I felt free. This was truly the end. Derek opened the door behind me, a hint of relief and pride in his expression. You did the right thing, man. I nodded, the truth settling in. I was done being her fallback, done letting her mistakes define me. I was free to rebuild, to find a future beyond the ashes she'd left behind. As Derek and I walked down the street toward the restaurant, I felt the first hint of peace in a long time. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape, no longer tied to the past. And in that quiet, unwavering moment, I knew I was ready to move forward, for good.